Let's talk for a few minutes about finding claims. Claims give direction and purpose to arguments. Other ingredients of arguments are very important too. Evidence and reasoning, for example. We'll look at these ingredients in the next part of this module. But claims are a good place to start. Where there is a claim, explicitly stated or implied, there is an argument. Someone is asserting that something is true, or that something is morally right, or maybe that a particular course of action should be chosen. With your students, practicing noticing claims may therefore be a good initial focus as you introduce or reintroduce the idea of arguments and argumentation. Using a variety of texts, you can ask your students, what claim or claims is the author of this text making? What does he or she want us to believe is true? Or what is he or she telling us we should do? It turns out that discerning claims is not always easy or straightforward. Some texts explicitly state a claim and signal to the reader that that's what they're doing. Other texts do not explicitly state a claim. A claim is implied, but the reader has to infer that claim and put it into words in his or her own head. Other texts may contain more than one claim, maybe even a mix of explicit and implied claims. In sum, discerning claims is challenging work and requires practice. It requires that students become claims detectives. Here's our plan for the next 5 minutes. We'll talk briefly about some general principles regarding claims, the different forms they can take, how many of them there can be in a text, and so on. We'll look at some examples, and we'll take a quiz. First, 3 general principles about claims, or 3 things for students to be aware of when they start looking for claims. The first general principle is this: claims can be explicit or implied. In some texts, they are stated word for word and clearly signaled as claims, but they can also be left unstated. In these cases, it's up to the reader or viewer to infer them and formulate them on his or her own. Images often have implied claims. This Coca-Cola billboard does not explicitly state a claim. It is left to the reader to infer the claim that consuming Coca-Cola will make you happy, or maybe that Coca-Cola is a healthy, natural product. But it isn't just images, poems, and other such texts that contain implied claims. Informational texts and even reports of scientific research may contain implied claims too. Take, for example, a text that reports on the recent rapid melting of the polar ice cap. This text might not explicitly say anything about the need for us to take immediate and drastic action to reduce human greenhouse gas emissions, yet this claim might be strongly implied. And this last point brings us to our next general principle about claims. Principle 2. Texts may contain a single claim or multiple claims. This general principle applies to newspaper editorials and research reports as much as to novels and advertisements. Often a text will have one main claim that leaps out at us, such as war is horrific or motorcyclists should be required by law to wear helmets, but also other claims, subclaims, and implied claims. Which brings us to our third and last general principle. Claims may be of different types. Beyond the matter of being explicit or implied, claims can be claims of fact. For example, there are fewer farmers today than in 1990. Claims of judgment, for example, farming is a heroic job. Or claims of policy, for example, the IRS should give a tax credit to farmers to encourage more Americans to choose farming as a career. These different types of claims match up with a common way of categorizing arguments as forensic, epidictic, or deliberative. To sum up then, 1. Claims can be explicit or implied. 2. Texts may contain multiple claims. And 3. There are different types of claims. Let's now look at 2 example texts. These examples will illustrate the general principles we just discussed, and we can also use them as an opportunity to start discussing good ways to engage our students in becoming claims detectives. Example 1 is an excerpt from an article about the global freshwater crisis. While each member of a family living in an arid area of Africa uses 10 to 40 liters of water a day for drinking, cooking, and washing, an urban European or North American family uses 300 to 600 liters a day per person. The most obvious claims here are explicitly stated claims of fact about water consumption. Yet there is also the implied claim of judgment that North American families consume a disproportionate amount of the world's fresh water and that this high rate of consumption is wasteful. The article does not explicitly assert this, but the author's decision to juxtapose these particular numbers, instead of juxtaposing more similar North American and European numbers, for example, suggests the presence of an implied claim about the glaring difference. Example 2 is from a poem by Wilfred Owen about a wounded veteran of the First World War. He sat in a wheeled chair, waiting for dark, and shivered in his ghastly suit of gray, legless, sewn short at elbow. Through the park voices of boys rang, saddening like a hymn, voices of play and pleasure after day, till gathering sleep had mothered them from him. In this text, there are lines that we can take as claims of fact, if we consider the poem to refer realistically to an actual veteran sitting in a wheelchair. Yet here the main claims may be ones that are implied. For example, from the grim and somber description of the veteran in his wheelchair, we may infer the claim, there is nothing heroic or satisfying about fighting in a war. As we conclude this video, let's talk for a minute more specifically about engaging your students in becoming claims detectives and helping them develop a sharp eye for the things we've been talking about, different types of claims, the presence of implied claims as well as explicit claims, and so on. Later in this module, you will spend a few minutes reviewing an activity sheet and adapting it for use with your students. For now, here are some general ideas to think about as you do that activity or as you ponder other ways of engaging your students in learning about claims. 1. It takes a lot of practice to become a good claims detective. Using a gradual release of responsibility approach, starting with explanation and modeling, and then moving through group-guided practice with lots of support, and into more independent practice with less support, give your students as many opportunities as you can to practice noticing and identifying claims in texts. 2. Start by using simpler texts for learning of more complex ideas, such as the idea that claims can be implied and not always explicitly stated. Once your students grasp the basic idea of implied claims, they can move on to finding them in more challenging texts. And 3. Try to provide a variety of texts so students can compare claims in different texts and notice the different forms that these claims can take. Even if you are primarily interested in familiarizing your students with the sorts of claims made in your content area, much will be learned from exploring the contrasts. This brings us to the end of this video. When you're ready, please return to the module home page to take the Finding Claims quiz.